Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 459. All right, guys, welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise awareness of trauma and to support new trauma therapists just starting out on their trauma-informed journey. I do that through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. If you're a therapist of any kind, interested in learning about trauma, and you're looking for support and inspiration, I invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 by going to traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist, the number 2.com. All right, let's get started. Several years ago when I was in graduate school and just starting seeing clients, I was doing a lot of commuting, like an hour and a half each way to my site. I was always thinking about my clients. What am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what the heck I'm doing. Why didn't I do that? Why I should have done that? And I always thought to myself, wouldn't it be awesome if I had a seasoned master trauma therapist sitting right there beside me in the passenger seat? Well, obviously that didn't happen. So I created the program, and it's Trauma Therapist 2.0. It's my online community specifically dedicated for new trauma workers. If that's you, if you're just starting out on this trauma-informed journey, you're passionate about this work, and you're looking to gain confidence, you're looking to share your journey, share your challenges, and share your wins, to get inspiration, also to help to inspire others, I want to invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 by going to traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist, the number 2.com. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Guy McPherson here, and I am very excited to have as my guest today, April Harter. April, welcome.
Hi.
All right. So April is a former medical social worker where she provided counseling to her patients and their family members to help them cope with the trauma of medical emergencies in the state of Texas. Later, she moved to Colorado and started her private practice to serve QTPOC patients with a history of racial trauma. After having worked with QTPOC patients, she decided to help prevent racism in society by working with white clients as a coach using the racist signature theory. Finally, she opened up the Racism Recovery Center to provide psychotherapy for the treatment of racism. And for those of our listeners, April, who don't know what QTPOC means or didn't have to look it up before they started interviewing you, what's that stand for?
So that's like one of those trendy terms nowadays. Trust me, I had to get myself initiated in that years ago. So it means queer, trans, people of color. That's what it means.
Awesome. All right. Well, first off, again, thank you for coming on the podcast. Before we get going, share with our listeners where you're from and where you're calling from.
Okay, so I live here in Manitou Springs, Colorado, which is right next door to Colorado Springs, and which is kind of like more of the southern portion of Colorado.
Okay, awesome. So, look, let's just get going here. A week ago or so, one of my listeners, as we're recording this in the wake of all the craziness that's been going on with the George Floyd and the riots and COVID, one of my listeners reached out to me and said, you need to interview this woman regarding racism and trauma. And I looked you up, and I mean, this is what you do. This is what you do. And I was like, all right, let's go. Let's see if she wants to come on, and here you are. So there are a lot of ways and angles at which we can, approach this, but I want to kind of give you the lead here and share with us, I guess, briefly how you started doing this.
Well, first of all, I didn't expect to do this. That's not something I didn't wake up as a Black person and go, I'm going to treat white people for racism. I didn't. But what happened is that after the Unite the Right rally in 2017, I felt that there was something I needed to do. And I just instinctively felt like something needed to be done. But that's how I kind of knew. It was kind of like the precursor to know, like that I needed to combine basically understanding racism and psychology. That's how I initially knew I needed to do something. But at that time, the Racism Recovery Center was long, like I hadn't even thought of treating white people. At the time, I thought that dealing with white people just meant teaching critical race theory, because that's basically the way that it's always been done. It's always been about, if we're going to address racism, it's about institutional racism versus personal racism. And that's what I did. And I basically found out that that it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
That what doesn't work?
So if you want to try to help a white person to stop acting in racist ways, it's deeply psychological, and it's not as simple as read this book, do these do these 10 steps. I learned the hard way that is not the way to stop personal racism.
How did you learn that?
Through trial and error. I first started actually coaching white psychotherapists.
Mm-hmm.
And I first started coaching white psychotherapists because in Colorado, when I first opened up my private practice, I was seeing a lot of people of color. And I kept on getting calls and them saying, I really, for the most part, like my white therapist, but when I talk about racism, my therapist tells me that I'm probably imagining things. So So it was very unprofessional going into countertransference with their racism, right? So I was like, okay, like this is very unethical, right? So I thought, why don't we get together as therapists in the state of Colorado? And then I eventually extended it to the United States. And it was a Facebook group just for therapists. So we could talk about, racism and therapy and stuff like that. Well, basically, so I started coaching these white folks. And what happened was that I basically, when I would say, oh, you're doing this and this is racist, because I said, tell me it's racist, and then I won't do it again. So then I was like, okay, so tell me what happened. Okay. And then, okay, that was racist, and that was racist. And then they're like, okay, I'll never do it again. And so they're, experiencing a lot of shame and insecurity and whatnot, right? And so then I would then have a coaching with them the following week, and they would make the same errors. And I thought, I'm not effective. I'm not helping them. No.
Okay. So, I mean, I want to know what those specifics were, but let's kind of back out from that. So what did you do? You realized you weren't effective. So what did you do? What did you start to do or need to do?
I pretty much started everything I kind of sort of knew from scratch. I kind of had to throw away everything that I had been taught about how to educate white people on racism, and really like, how do I create effective change with a white person when it comes to racism? So I had to go against the status quo. And what I realized is that they were going into defense mechanisms, and I could tell those defense mechanisms were preventing them from learning. So I knew it had to be something with those defense mechanisms. So I did some Googling, a little research, and I came across the term racist defense. Oh, that makes sense. Racist defense mechanism. But that's really all I saw. Oh, this white person's, going into racist defense mechanisms, and Robin DiAngelo, and talking about white fragility, which I am not a fan of, by the way. And I could talk about that later. I don't like that term, white fragility, because it's not accurate. It's actually not very trauma informed. But anyway, I saw that Robin DiAngelo and different people said, oh, there's such a thing as racist defense mechanisms and white fragility. But then when I was like, well, why? Why do they have, quote, white fragility? Why do they have racist defense mechanisms? And I couldn't find anything. So that's when I started to I basically had to go through my mind and think of all the white coaching clients that I had that were psychotherapists. And I basically had to recount, or really kind of like think about all the interactions that we've had. And that's when I started to notice patterns.
Oh, well, this is fascinating. I mean, so keep going.
This is really, that's what happens when you talk to someone who invented a psychological theory, right? You're going to hear like how it works, right?
Well, the whole thing it is fascinating. I mean, my mind is going so many different ways. Obviously, we're in the midst of this, this tidal wave of, events and emotions and everything. And you're the perfect person to speak to right now on this podcast. So what did you notice? You went back and you reviewed the white coaching clients. I mean, the thing that struck me right off the bat is on your website, you're like, I help white people get, become more. That is, I think you're not mincing any words there.
No, not at all.
Like I teach about race. I teach white people basically to become more educated, more informed.
Yeah. I actually heal them. I do more than educate. So that's the thing, is that was the huge twist. See, when you think about critical race theory and like, quote, so you have basically, you have personal racism and then you have institutional racism, which is the micro and the macro, right? And the majority of like the people who have spearheaded this work have typically been sociologists. They've been, typically sociologists, historians. And it's just a matter of, white people, you just need to know your history. You just need to not repeat it. You just need to,
this book.
Read this book, do these 10 steps, and then the white folks are like, well, I've done all these things and like, I still am acting in racist ways. And that happened where I was, and then of course, white people hire people like me at the time, when I was coaching, well, point this racism out to me because I've got blind spots. And I even thought that was enough because everybody was doing it, everybody under the sun. Well, I'm POC. I'm a person of color. I'm a therapist. I'm pretty insightful. I just need to point out this racism to this white person. And that's really all I thought I had to do. But when I did it, so when I point out the racism, that creates that cognitive dissonance. That's a very unsettling, vulnerable feeling when you think you kind of are fairly grounded and you think you know yourself pretty well. Right. And then you have somebody tell you that you act in a racist way. Especially if you're a white person that's very well-meaning, you definitely don't want to act in racist ways. And you find out I have no control over the situation. All of this stuff is like, I'm doing stuff and I don't even know I'm doing it. Right. So then I was trying to figure out like, why is it that white people have these blind spots? And that's when I basically created what I called racist signature patterns. There's 42 racist signature patterns, but basically they are layers. So I am going to talk a little bit. I normally don't do this, but because there's going to be so many therapists listening to this, I do want to kind of teach you just a little bit, if you mind, about my theory, just a little bit. So I want you to imagine like concentric circles, right? So there is like an outer band, and there's a second little band, and then there's like a third one in the core. So what I noticed was that when white people go into racist defense mechanisms, so in other words, what I'm trying to tell you guys, that there was no construction of this so-called racist defense mechanism. In our practice, like we go to theories and we go to like, well, what does it look like? Like, how is it constructed? I didn't have any theory. I did tons of research. So I found nothing. So then I had to use my coaching clients to analyze and figure out, what does it look like? So you have this outer band, this second band, and this little circle in the center. The outer band I call the primary racist signature, which is really like that first layer of defense. And then the second layer is I call the secondary racist signature, which is more of an internal layer of defense. And that little circle in the center is actually trauma. So let me give you an example. Let's say that a person of color told a white person, you're acting in a racist way. Like you did something XYZ and that was racist. So then the white person, you're going to hear them say, and not every white person says, but this is very common, which is they go into, by the way, I have 7 racist signatures. I'll get to that in a minute. So the most common response that white people tend to have when they are not aware of their racism, that they have these blind spots, is they tend to go into a state of denial and they go into intellectualization. Okay. So the outer band the first layer of defense would be, no. I mean, that I don't see that. And what's driving that? And then they go, well, let me tell you why. And that's the intellectualization. And so for that, a coaching client might have a core of, for example, or one of my therapy clients might have a core of fear, embarrassment, shame that is really driving that. And all those feelings are really unresolved traumas, as I've discovered consistently, childhood trauma. I mean, consistently. People always ask me, well, what trauma? What trauma? And I'm like, childhood trauma, because guess what? You're acting in a narcissistic way. So what I'm trying to say here is that racism is a form of narcissism. And basically, I discovered I wasn't the only one that was seeing racism as a type of narcissism. There were other therapists who did this. In fact, after World War II, there were Jewish psychiatrists that were trying to study the SS and the other Nazis, because they're like, we got to prevent another Holocaust. This racism is like, my God, you know? And that kind of fell through the cracks. And then in the 1980s, there were two Black therapists, one a psychiatrist, the other one, I think Alvin Poussaint. He actually was a psychiatrist who consulted with the Cosby Show, and he made the connection between mental illness and racism. And everybody, just called, he was a laughingstock, right? And they just kind of blew him off. And then Carl C. Bell, also a psychologist, clinical psychologist, he went ahead and said, yeah, like there's a connection between narcissism and racism. And again, people just went, oh, that's just can't be. He went to the APA and said, well, so he wrote in the Oxford Dictionary of, personality disorders and co-occurring disorders and whatnot. And he basically, wrote that. He said, here are the symptoms. And so he sent this to the APA and said, we need to get this in the DSM. And the APA said, but there's just too many people with symptoms like this. I mean, we agree with you that the symptoms are there, but we can't, like, there's just too many. So like, that can't be actually a disease and a dysfunction because there's just too many people. I mean, Guy, I can't make this up. This is literally the response that they had. So that was very, from my viewpoint, and I can hear your response, very irresponsible from the APA, right? So they just flat out like ignored. And then it just pretty much went by the wayside for many, 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 many years. And people just kind of kicked it around, but didn't take it seriously. And then I picked it up. And that's when I created, my psychological theory, because I didn't know that when I started working with these white psychotherapists that they actually were reacting due to trauma. I didn't know until I started working with them, because I was trying to figure out, why can't I teach these white people? Why are they being so defensive? Like, why? And it's trauma. And I was like, wow.
So okay. So I'm just trying to get my head around this. So you're saying most, if not all, of white people who are racist or express racism or act in a racist way do so as a result of some childhood trauma.
Yes. So like abuse or neglect.
Right.
And so I'm essentially treating someone who I believe that narcissism is a spectrum. So I'm treating someone typically for PTSD and it's unresolved from childhood. Right. And it's interesting because if a white person were to have some kind of conflict with another white person, it might not come out, that trigger. You know what I'm talking about. But then if it's a different type of conflict, suddenly it comes out. And so really, it's really a trip, because racism is both, and narcissism is taught, right? We know that narcissism is taught intergenerationally. Basically, I'm treating the trauma of the narcissist. But the thing is, when we think of narcissists, it's so like taboo, and you're the bad person, you're the worst of the worst. And the thing is that the people that I treat are very specific. They are what I call basically covert narcissists. They basically act in unintentionally racist ways. So I say that they're covert racists, right? And versus I don't work with overt racists or overt narcissists, because really in the stage of change, they're not ready. So there's in the public right now, when I see anti-racism educators say, in order to help, to do something, and then they're saying, why don't you white people do something? I totally understand that. I understand politics. I'm a democratic socialist. I mean, I am big time political, right? But the thing is that when white people are stuck in that trauma and they're in that freeze state, okay, I don't care how much you yell, shame, scream at them, they're going to sit still. So essentially what I learned is that the foundation of really authentic anti-racism is getting healing. And I distinguish anti-racism from what I call racism recovery, which is essentially you've acted in racist ways and you need trauma recovery and you struggle with narcissism, right? Mm-hmm. And so at the end of the day, when I look at a white person, most white people actually perpetrate racism unintentionally. They really, really do. However, the pedagogy of anti-racism is that all white people are complicit. But that's just not true in my clinical experience. It's just not true. They just are. And where do the blind spots come from? Well, right. It's dissociation. It's dissociation.
So what are some, go on, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. No, you're fine.
Okay. So what are some examples of how some therapists acted from your experience or when you were coaching that were racist and they were like, oh my God, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that.
Well, so one is, there's two. I love that you asked that question. So, because what you're basically asking is, you're a Black woman, don't they interact racist with you? Absolutely. Absolutely. The most common one, the most common racist defense mechanism, and I call it racist saviorism. They go into saviorism, which is, I pity you and I feel sorry for you, April, that you're Black, and I'm ashamed of myself for being white, right? And that is actually codependency. This is when they kick into codependency. And we all know that codependency is definitely connected to childhood trauma. So a lot of like the white people on Instagram and on social media and everyone's freaking out, bless their heart, they're kicking right into codependency with people of color. And people of color are now on the other side of the coin. They're very racially traumatized, right? So they are like, save us.
Right.
So on one hand, we do need white people to get on board. Absolutely. But there are so many people of color that need racial trauma healing and they're acting out in hypervigilance. So it's totally legit, totally understandable why everybody's angry. I get it. But if, as a POC, if you don't get that racial trauma healing, you are not going to be able to hold space for a white person's unintentional racism. And that's why a lot of POCs say you are complicit. And so there's a misunderstanding and a lack of compassion for white people. And that's understandable because that sounds crazy. We're like, why would you have compassion for these perpetrators, right? But the thing is that I actually developed that compassionate detachment through introspection and yoga. Funny thing, that I actually initially came to this awakening after I had done some yoga and did some asanas. And I was like, it was a shift, Guy, between, dang it, these white people, they just don't care. And they're always just doing it on purpose and they don't care about us, to, oh my God, these white people, some of them really don't know what they're doing. And that's what got me shifted in to try to problem solve. Because let me tell you, my own racial trauma was preventing me from problem solving. Absolutely.
This is very interesting because I thought in part during this conversation, we'd be speaking a lot about the trauma that racism causes. Not that trauma causes, a lot of racism. My initial sense is that a lot of people, a lot of white therapists, would think that their unintended racist acts, just feel very, well, I didn't know this. I wasn't aware of the fact that I was doing this racist thing.
Yes.
And that's where it stops. right? I guess
Yes,
that's what you were
yes,
talking about when you were saying,
yes,
let me get the 6 steps right and then I can do it. As
yes,
opposed to, well, wait a minute. Wait, I have all this trauma. I'm a narcissist and that's where
yes,
this is
yes.
emanating from. That's heavy and deep.
Oh, brother, tell me about it. Like, I'm just like, I feel like Cornel West. I'm like, brother, I'm like, dang, like, yes,
Right.
because Guy, do you think that I knew this can of worms I was going to open? Like, I mean, I'm just like doing social work values and ethics. I'm just, I can't find anything. And then I open up a can of worms. So white people have trauma. So like that trauma keeps, I mean, think about it. A narcissist, trauma keeps them rooted in narcissism and in those defense mechanisms. So
Yeah.
the example that you said right now, like, oh, I think I'm just going to read stuff, that I called that's racist intellectualization. And that's
Right.
not heart-centered. I mean, that's not coming from a place of healing. So as you can imagine, when you have enough white people, they just think, I'm going to read a bunch of stuff. And then, of course, they're trying to do what POCs say, which is read stuff, do these
Right.
10 steps. It's all performative allyship, Guy. So basically, anti-racism, and I'm very firm on this, they literally are not trauma informed, are teaching performative allyship to white people, and white people eat it up because they struggle with perfectionism, which is also connected to narcissism. We live in a very narcissistic culture. It's racist perfectionism, and it just goes around and around in a circle, and nothing gets done. No. So what anchors it, and where the blind spots really are, is the trauma. So through the theory in those concentric circles, we're now peeling back the layers of the defenses, and then we connect the dots to get to the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what needs to be attended to, because basically, until you address the trauma, a white person's still going to react defensively. They're still going to. So it's very much like a symbiotic relationship. They're not separate. See, we have really intellectual, what it is, guys, that our profession needs to take over when it comes to the psychology of the perpetrator. We need to take over. And so my goal in so many ways is to not only treat the racist, and help them heal to prevent racism in society legitimately and authentically. Because performative allyship is not authentic. We can fake it till we make it all we want. You know what I'm saying? But then it's really not true deep healing. And that's what I really want to try to do, so that it's permanent and it lasts and it increases intimacy. So here's the negative part about when anti-racism educators teach performative allyship. What happens is that the white person, I would say it's good for strangers that you don't really know, because it's etiquette. Oh, you met this person, and you want to behave a certain way to get along. But what happens, Guy, when you're, I don't know, married to a person of color?
Mm-hmm.
What if you have children that are people of color? Once you get into the intimacy, you can't fake it anymore. Mm-hmm. This is where the interracial conflict happens, right? And so white people, through the history of our country in America, the racial segregation has made it to where white people struggle to have intimacy with POC. And again, they learn this racism intergenerationally. I call it intergenerational racist perpetration, which is very similar. If you've ever heard of the book by Dr. Joy DeGruy, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, I'm on the opposite end of that. So Dr. Joy DeGruy is a fellow clinical social worker. She's a PhD. I'm not a PhD yet. I would love for my theory to be more dissertation. But basically, she talks about intergenerational racial trauma, right, from slave times, right?
Right.
I'm talking about intergenerational race perpetration, where where white people they're taught narcissism, and it's mixed in with childhood trauma. So it's all connected to violence. It's all connected to, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, all that. Mm-hmm. And essentially what actually happens with a white person was when they start gaslighting with that racist intellectualization, which a lot of white therapists do, and they go, oh, well, that's not factual, that's not this. And when they dismiss their colleagues or their own patients or clients, they're projecting unhealed trauma. Their shame is triggered. And that's where people think, oh, they're white and fragile. I'm like, no, that's shame-based PTSD is what that is. They are all kinds of needing help. And so then what happens that white people go in society and they go into quote white fragility, which again, I can't stand that term because it doesn't appropriately represent it. When you have somebody like Robin DiAngelo, who's not a clinician, I don't care how famous she is, when you have someone who's a layperson in psychology dabbling in trauma and they're not trauma informed, that's going to cause more damage than good, right? And so basically a bunch of white people essentially on Instagram and social media and all over the place, they're trying to follow all these rules so that they don't hurt people of color in their interracial like interactions. But then if they slip, then they hate themselves. And let me tell you something, Guy, that's really sad, since we're going down that little dark pathway, right? Which since we might as well go there, all right? This is, all right, Guy, this is really bad. You know, I really was concerned when I started receiving DMs from white people on Instagram a year and a half ago telling me, I'm so glad I came across your work because about 6 months ago, I attempted suicide. So white people, this is the elephant in the room. These white people that follow these influencers like Rachel Cargill and like Layla Saad and all these people, when they interact with them, they are shamed in these spaces if they don't get it right. And then they actually experience so at the core is the childhood trauma, but you know what? They also experience perpetrator trauma. So this is essentially something, again, we don't talk about perpetrator trauma, which is basically like, for example, if you're a combat veteran or like, even if like you were in a gang, like if you killed somebody, if you did something really violent, you are actually going to feel really, really guilty and ashamed of yourself. And there's going to be like a lot of self-hatred, right? So white people also experience perpetrator trauma. So when that happens, and then they're also shamed, it sends them into what they like to call, like my followers, I see this online, like shame spiral. And then they ruminate and it's traumatizing. And then they just get depressed. They think they're hopeless. They're told, oh, it takes a whole lifetime for you to learn how to stop your personal racism. And they think it's hopeless. And then they get depressed. And then, well, you know where that leads to: suicidal ideation and then unaddressed suicidal attempts. All this stuff has been going down and nobody knows about it because I basically decided to advocate for white people because I was seeing this happening and I didn't want to go with the clique because dang it, I need to sleep at night. You know, I'm not gonna, like lots of people go, oh, April, don't you go in solidarity with other people of color? I'm like, oh, but I'm a therapist and like I have ethics and like, you know, like if I see someone being shamed and they want to kill themselves, you know, I can't just turn the other cheek for the sake of justice because that's hypocritical. That's actually injustice. So I never expected to be advocating for white people. I thought, let me just teach these white people how to behave. I just thought initially, you know, like they just need to behave. You just need to, you know, and I learned really quickly, wow, this is trauma. You know, and so I'm really ahead of my time and it's going to take a while for people to kind of like catch up. And I got to write my books.
when people listen to you or when white people therapists work with you and you tell them this and talk to them about this, what is their reaction?
They feel so validated. They're heard.
They feel validated.
Seen. Oh yeah. They're like, because I'm kind of like the racist whisperer. Like they can actually like, I know like their lingo and their thing, how they're acting, and they feel a sense of relief knowing that I understand them and where that's coming from instead of I'm just going to make a moral judgment and that's all I'm going to do. So my job is not to like morally judge. My job is to treat. So
I guess I would think that a lot of people would be surprised that, what do you mean? My actions, my racist actions, my unintentional racist actions are emanating from trauma, right? Not just the fact that I didn't remember step number 5 from the anti-racist book, but it's so much more. I guess to me, I'm surprised. I'm not surprised, but I am surprised that this is the cause of this. You know, it's not surprising when you think how culturally embedded racism is. And it goes back, right? And
Mhm.
you can think, of course, where does violence or degradation from one person towards another come from? It often comes from hurt. What do they
Oh.
say? Hurt people, right?
Yes, yes. And it's the same way with sexism too. When my clients coach with me or when my patients come to me, they're like, "Oh my gosh, like when you explain this, like that's like you could apply that to sexism and homophobia and stuff." I'm like, "Yeah." So it's like basically I came up with I the goal was to address racism, but essentially my theory can kind of you can basically look at any
Hmm.
type of like identity discrimination and you can essentially apply that to it. Um, because when you think about it, I mean, like, for example, sexism, right? I mean, it's rooted in narcissism. A lot of men, for example, don't know when they're acting in sexist ways. They think it's totally normalized and embedded, right? It's just another type of narcissism, right? So that I just see myself as a narcissist specialist that focuses on racism, right? Regardless of whether or not it's in the DSM, because it's there, the symptoms are there. Um, but actually, most of the narcissists that I work with are codependent. So even Darlene Lancer, even she says that, who is a super, I'm sure like she's a super, that's her thing, is like codependency. And she even writes like, yeah, codependency is narcissistic because that's proximity to power. So
Hmm.
but the point is like, okay, but the narcissism, why is there this emptiness? Why is there this empty shell? Because you've got that wounded inner child, and that wounded inner child was literally emotionally scarred as a child. And so the narcissist is trying to fill that in. Guy, a lot of white people, when I work with them, they don't think that they have childhood trauma.
Right.
They think that because they are white and have white privilege and like they received, tangible support, that they don't want to, of course, they don't want to talk about, oh no, my parents were fine. I mean, they helped us and financially they were, so, but when we start peeling back the layers, it turns out that the perfectionism, which comes from their own narcissistic parents, are
Hmm.
projected onto them. And then they basically internalize that. And they're simultaneously taught racist schemas. So essentially, racism in America and throughout the world, you learn racist schemas, in your family, in television, propaganda, you absorb it. And then you have traumas. So I've had lots of white people say, but April, I've been to therapy for 5 years. Like, that's all cute and all that you do that, April, but like, cause they're in a state of denial. And they're like, that's cute. Like, April, like, how about like, I already go to my own therapist. Like, why don't you just help me deal with the racism part?
Right. Right.
So they're in a state of denial, right? Because
Hmm.
they're like, this is cracking their brains wide open, right? They're like, that's impossible. But when I use my theory and we go through those little concentric circles and they are able to connect the dots, that's when they're like, oh my gosh, it is trauma. I didn't even know that I had that trauma. So, you know what racism does? Racism actually, even if a white person goes to a therapist and actually does get like some beautiful treatment for trauma, they could still have a blind spot because the racism actually causes white people to become emotionally immature in certain degrees.
Hmm.
So that's also where those blind spots are, right? So it's since it's socially acceptable, it's actually going to cause you to act in dysfunctional ways in a racist way. But since it's normalized, it's going to hold you back. It's going to hold you back from emotional maturity. So yeah, so lots of white people don't know that there are parts of their self-esteem that do need to be examined. My coaching clients say, what do you mean, April? Like, are you seriously here to tell me that the way to like deal with my racism is like self-compassion and self-love? I'm like, yeah.
Mm.
Because they have trauma. So then I don't deserve it. I'm white and I have white privilege and I feel like I'm coddling, you're coddling me. And I'm like, no, this is actually really serious. What we gotta do is we gotta end that racist, in other words, we gotta heal that trauma so that you're not going into racist defense mechanisms. Because otherwise you're gonna keep on acting in defensive ways.
All right, let me just break here for a second. We're talking with April Harter. We're talking about race and healing white people, and the this sounds like definitely not an easy fix.
No.
Where's the hope?
You're already going through the stages of grief, guy. So
It's
let me
intense.
it's very intense. So let me tell you, but I've been doing this for 2 years. So, and so like, it's, I feel comfortable with it, but it's, when you hear it for the first time, it's really, most therapists, when you hear it, it's like, that makes total sense. But then, oh my gosh, not all white people actually want to get treatment.
Right,
No, they
right.
don't, because of course not, because overt narcissists are not going to want to grandiosity. You're not going to get somebody from the KKK. Yeah, sign me up for racism recovery. You're not going to, get that. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you're not going to get that. But the average white person, who, let's say, they have a serious interracial. So the question you're really asking kind of is, who is the ideal candidate? Like, who are the type of people who tend to come to me, right? And it's going to be the white person that actually has intimate relationships with POC. So it can be like a white therapist because, I mean, there's some intimacy going on there in psychotherapy. I mean, that's like a pretty intimate little space there, right? And you're seeing your client, on a regular basis. Also, interracial families. Okay, that's another example. Coworkers. So it's those intimate relationships that cause people to want to come to me. And what ultimately motivates them is really like care and love. So for the family, it would be love. And for like people like who are psychotherapists, it would be like that, unconditional positive regard. I mean, you're talking about like, you care a lot to try to do good and to be good a therapist as you can. And you really don't want to harm another person of color in your psychotherapy practice, right? So you're trying to do the right thing, right? So that's how that is. But you're going through the stages of grief because every person that hears what I'm saying, especially if they're white, I mean, you're going to laugh when I tell you this, but like, this is literally the same thing. Let me tell you I'm going to tell you exactly what happens every time. So white people, first of all, to get to this point where they believe what I'm saying, that racism is connected to mental illness, like first they go through denial. Oh no, what? No, that can't be. Institutional racism, like that's just a sinister thing. And like, it has nothing to do with mental health. Right. And then they start taking in my content on Instagram and whatnot. And then they start to get really pissed and they get angry. And then they're like, this Black woman just is kissing butt to white people. She really just doesn't care about Black people or other people of color. She out of her mind. And then they're just like, they leave, right? But then they come back and they go into the bargaining stage and they're like, but didn't anti-racism teach me something? And I'm like, well, anti-racism, in my viewpoint, I believe that, and basically when it comes to addressing personal racism, anti-racism, and I mean this seriously, like this, I'm telling you, this is fair. I'm a heretic, right? But it's the truth. It does nothing for people. And all you got to do is look around and see the evidence. It does nothing for people. White people fake it till they make it because they're trying to avoid interracial conflict, right? They're avoiding that shame. I don't want to be labeled a racist, Yeah. So that happens, right? Like, let me act this way. Let me hire this consultant. Let me look and polish myself so I don't look like a racist, right? But that doesn't actually really solve the problem. So what anti-racist educators, what I feel that they're best at doing, this is where I think they need, so they're basically out of their scope of practice. What they need to be doing is focusing on like the law, activism, and making sure that history is truly anti-racist. And you're not just making up, you're not erasing history, right? So to me, true anti-racism is connected to policy, education, and the law, right? Making sure all that's in check. But what has happened, Guy, is that you've got all these random people from a variety of settings that say, I'm going to like use anti-racism to essentially help white people stop their racist behaviors. And lo and behold, they're not psychotherapists. They don't have any kind of theory to like kind of really help them zone in on like what's actually happening. And what this does actually is it re-traumatizes people of color who do this work in anti-racism. So they don't realize they're stepping into the room with a bunch of perpetrators that don't even know what they're doing. And they are not trauma informed themselves, right? So you're stepping into a room with a bunch of people that are basically acting in unconsciously, unintentionally racist ways. And if you haven't healed from your racial trauma, you're also going to re-expose yourself to more pain and suffering. So then the result of that is this is where you get the Rachel Cargills, and she's cursing at white people and telling them they're worth nothing. So you get all this, white people feel unworthy. They feel that they don't deserve to get better. They feel that they have to pay penances. Reparations definitely needs to go down, but like my concern is that, yeah, if we throw a bunch of money out there, but guess what? I mean, we can throw a bunch of money out there, but guess what? People are still going to act in racist ways and they don't even understand why. So we need to go deeper. And the people that tend to go deeper, they are the white people that are the covert racists, again, who are in these intimate relationships that are, again, racially integrated. So white people that don't racially integrate, right, they learn racism and they'll never be confronted with an interracial conflict, and they're really much in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you know, right? I mean, we're talking about trauma and relationships. Like, how will you even know that you did something wrong unless somebody tells you, or some kind of conflict happens in the relationship? You're just not going to know.
Right. So as we wind down here, what can people, therapists I know therapists are listening to this, who are going, oh my God, all right, what do I need to do? What can I do? What can I do? And I mean that seriously. What steps can they take? Can they take? And we talk, we talk a little bit about books, basically, but what do you think they do?
Well, I literally wrote.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I wrote a post about this because see how quickly you said what I can do, right? So that's like, again, going into intellectualization. Like, give me the 10 steps. Like, I wrote a post on Instagram, and I called it, "What can you do right now?" Because I had enough people saying, "What can we do right now?" And so if you don't mind, I'm gonna read my post because I think that this is applicable. Okay. So, pardon me. All of you struggle to trust yourselves. The most important thing you need to do right now is to develop self-trust. You don't trust yourself to make decisions because you have discovered that you can't see your racism. So that means that you can't be trusted. And you're right. You can't trust yourself to see your own racism because because it's deeply unconscious. But here's what you can learn to do. Trust me. Many of you still aren't at a point yet where you trust me over these anti-racism influencers you've been following, even though there is this little whisper in your ear that tells you that I can help you. And you're ignoring, yourself because you don't trust yourself. You can't trust yourself to identify your racism, but you need to take the time to learn how to discern who to trust when it comes to helping you along this path to help you learn how to heal your racism. That's right, heal your racism. And in so doing, you're then able to perform activism that is truly anti-racist. So it's hard to slow down, but when it comes to personal racism, slow down you must. And then I told all the white people on my Instagram, I said, I encourage you to go purchase the book by Cynthia Wall, LCSW, The Courage to Trust. Because right now, the biggest problem we have right now, just on starting this journey towards racism recovery for white people, is that white people they are basically believing that as long as you're a person of color, you can be trusted and that you're competent to help you get out of this mess. What I have discovered is that actually you can't just get some random POC who understands racism because this is trauma. So then what white people do is they consume from so many different books and authors and workshops and this and that. And you really got to discern, but you can't do that because you typically don't even trust yourself on what to pick. So I would say really the first step is not on an activist front, but I'm talking about personal racism. So I'm not talking about activism, but about addressing your personal racism. You need to be able to know who to trust. And really and that was a post for my Instagram followers, but I know that sounds like trust in me. That's almost kind of creepy, but, but I'm but I'm serious, it's what I'm saying is just like we say anything else, right? I'm getting ready myself, in August to start EMDR training, right? Because I know that EMDR is going to nip that, trauma in the bud, and that's, evidence-based. I am a firm believer in evidence-based practice. And so white people need to first learn to trust themselves on what traits in someone like that you can go to. Because basically white people are kind of running around going, any POC that says if they do this, that will help me. And it's like, no, it's like, no, sweetie, that doesn't, if they're not trauma informed, and I will again say this very firmly, if you're not a psychotherapist, like basically you shouldn't be messing with white people and their personal racism, because I truly believe that psychotherapists are the best equipped. And eventually I'll like train psychotherapists in my method and all this kind of stuff. But that's the point. You don't want to, you don't go to if you want to get heart surgery done, you don't go to a brain surgeon. It's just, you need to go with those who are competent and understand. We just have a lot of people that, I get it. Like POC want to speak truth to power. I understand that. I'm all for that. But when it comes to helping the white person address that personal racism, we do need to peel back those layers of narcissism, look at that spectrum, and heal that trauma.
Oh. All right, April, look, man, there's so much to talk about. My God, this is eye-opening. And I know a lot of people are like having their eyes opened as well, listening to this. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Okay, so basically for psychotherapy, you would go to www.racismrecoverycenter.com. Okay. And for coaching, you would do racismrecoverycenter.com/coaching. I do have a waiting list, and coaching enrollment begins again in November. And what I do in coaching is I prep white people for therapy. So in other words, you get all the goodies without the treatment, so I can nicely prep you. And then when you're nice and done, send you off into an evidence-based trauma therapist to get you nice and healed once we get to those nuggets of trauma. So that's what we do in coaching.
Okay. And in terms of a go-to book recommendation, whether racism related or not, or trauma related or not, what would you offer? Yes.
I would say my future book, because nobody's really done what I've done. I didn't learn in that sense. If you don't mind, I would say that there is one person, though, not necessarily a book right off the bat, but like one person that I think totally informs me like big time about childhood trauma that really helps me understand narcissism. And of course, it's the awesome Gabor Mate. Oh, I love Gabor Mate. Oh my gosh. I love Gabor Mate. So for those of you that want to understand like narcissism and or rather go to YouTube and look up that video about like an addiction to power, Gabor Mate. You look that up, you watch that video, and you're going to see that childhood trauma. You're going to see how it's connected. And it's going to make more sense for you, because Gabor does such a beautiful job of helping people understand that, like, when you go through that childhood trauma, and he calls, of course, the world, and I agree with him, that the world is kind of like, quote, crazy. But what it is that we live in a narcissistic culture. And so that's really when he says it's like not healthy. That's how I see it. And he does talk about narcissism. So I think Gabor Mate is a good go-to person about narcissism and childhood trauma.
Awesome. All right, I'll have him linked up. Previous guest on the podcast, Gabor Mate. I'll have that linked up at the show notes page at thetraumatherapistpodcast.com. April, got to have you back, man. There's obviously a lot to talk about and a lot to heal.
Definitely.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on here.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. All right. Thank you so much for checking out the podcast. I really appreciate it. And if you're a new trauma therapist, if you're a student, if you're passionate about learning about trauma, if you're just starting out on your trauma-informed journey, I want to invite you to check out my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. It's specifically dedicated to therapists of all kinds who are just starting out, who want to be around other people who are doing this work, who are passionate about learning and learning from seasoned professionals. Check out Trauma Therapist 2.0. That's traumatherapist2.com. Traumatherapist2.com. All right. Have a great day.